Hello, welcome to Talk Wildlife, and today I'm going to talk about a project that I came across. In fact, there's a couple of projects that I came across both via social media and also by attending a talk. And it is a Scottish-based project, and we're going to start off talking about a small part of the project, which is the Argaty Red Kites area up in Scotland. And I have the owner with me, which is Tom Boyser. So hiya, Tom, how are you?
Hi, Alan. How are you doing? Thanks for having me.
No problem. Thank you for joining, because I mean, I know you're out quite remote, so I'm surprised we're even managing to talk. So we'll see how it goes. Right. So as I said up front, I came across you through a talk around the Scottish Rewilding Alliance. But I want to step back from that, and we'll touch on that a little bit towards the end and talk to you about your project, because once I started digging into that project, I found it really, really exciting. And your project basically is built around your farm. So I think what we really need to do is sort of introduce the farm and how long you've been there and all the rest of it. So for a start, how big is the farm and how long have you farmed in that area and where is it?
Okay, so Argaty, our family farm, is in the centre of Scotland, near to Stirling. We've had it as a family since 1916. My great-great-grandparents bought it. It's 1,400 acres, and our part of Scotland is traditionally, Alan, known as the gateway to the highlands. And you can kind of see it quite well on our landscape. So the southern half of the farm is all very nice, civilized grass parks and woodland, and then the top half is all wild, open moorland. So it's very much where those two landscapes and cultures meet and collide. I run it today with my parents, Lynn and Neil, and our contract farmers, Mark and Harriet, do the livestock management.
Right, and what is it that you farm up there?
So we're a beef and sheep farm using all native breeds. So we've got 700 ewes and we've got 70 beef cattle, and it's Aberdeen Angus and Highland Shorthorn that we have here. So all native breeds are very much suited to the landscape here, able to spend large parts of the year outdoors without any problem and convert fairly poor in a lot of places grass into protein. And have hopefully a good impact on the ecosystem around here.
Right, and you mentioned sort of the landscape. So give us an idea of the sort of makeup of the farm. I know that you, because obviously I've looked at your website and I've watched a couple of talks, but you know, I know you've got sort of ponds on there, you've got woodland on there. So give us an idea of different types of habitats that you've got up there. Yeah,
so the woodland is probably the thing that would strike you most if you visited Argaty. So of the 1,400 acres, about 400 acres of that is woodland, some very, very old trees. As you enter the estate, you come through a line of beech trees that must be about 200 years old. So yeah, big expanses of woodland, beech, oak, Scots pine, some lovely old stories with some of the trees here, the oaks here. A lot of them were felled to use as battleships for Trafalgar. So yeah, really, really lovely big woodlands. We've got a lot of hedgerow here as well. About a decade ago, we planted, I think it was about 2.5 kilometres of hedgerow linking up a lot of these woodlands so that then wildlife could have free passage between them. 16 ponds at last count. We keep on adding to them as and where we can find boggy, rushy areas that are no good for any kind of livestock grazing. And I guess the other half of the farm, so a lot of this is on the more productive areas that we've done this stuff. The big wide moors there, we really kind of leave them to their own devices for a large part. They're lightly grazed throughout the year, but they're really good areas for barn owls, long-eared owls, short-eared owls. Hen harriers come there in the winter. We get all of our kestrels up on the hill there as well. Good big, it's old grouse moor, but now there's no shooting here, but it's all just wide, full-rich pasture, which is really, really good for these smaller birds, the ones that live a bit more on the margins.
Okay, and before we go on to sort of the what and how you manage your farm in a wildlife sensitive way, what triggered the decision to go down that route? Why do you do it?
Well, really, I think for us, we do have a big interest in the natural environment, and that's something that's been passed down from generation to generation. The other things, I suppose, in a way, we've been lucky to be a bit resistant to some of the changes that have swept over agriculture in other parts of the country. So obviously with these kind of moorland areas here, they're totally resistant to any form of improvement, weed control or anything like that. So, that there's only really one way to farm them, and it's just rough grazing for hardy breeds of sheep and cattle. So that's part of the reason. We're also quite lucky, I suppose, that it's an inherited estate that has been passed down from generation to generation. So we haven't had overheads that we've had to meet that have meant that we've had to go for these kind of massive improvements, putting loads of fertilizer on, loads of weed killer, and all these sorts of things. We've been able to kind of pick and choose what was right for the land. But the main thing, I think, really, which is credit really to my parents, is that they've always been quite keen on diversifications here. So not just relying on the livestock to get us through, which, given everything that's happened just in my short lifetime here, I think it's been a very wise decision. We've come through BSE, but now all these things. Now we've got similar potential problems with Brexit and such like. They always knew that farming was going to be an inconsistent income, sometimes great, sometimes terrible. And they always made sure that we were doing lots of different things. And one of them, I suppose, was to try and make the best of the natural world around us and try and build a bit of a business around that. So we've been fortunate I've been fortunate because of decisions that they've made.
Right. And speaking of those decisions, so at what point during the life of the farm was the decision made that, right, okay, so we're now going to sort of manage it with wildlife in mind and protect biodiversity? And was there anything that had to be done at that point in order to change the way the farming was happening and the farm itself in order to accommodate that?
Well, as I say, I don't think there was ever really a conscious point where we thought we were ever going to change the way we farmed it from the traditional ways that were used before. But there are definitely things that focused our mind on what we were doing and made us maybe commit to it more. So the main thing was in 1996, the RSPB began reintroducing red kites to this part of Scotland. Now, the funny thing about this was that although these release cages were on the two neighbouring estates to the west of here, we had absolutely no idea that it was going on. First that we knew about it was when these birds came and started circling over the farmyard here, and eventually they kind of settled down. We had the first red kite nest in this area anyone knows of for over 100 years in 1998, and they fledged a couple of chicks from the nest just above the farm. And my parents and the RSPB, they set up this partnership. Soon on the back of that, people were coming up wanting to see these birds, because hard to believe now when there are so many red kites, but they were so rare that people would travel for miles to come and see them. Yeah. The RSPB were also coming out at the time, coming feeding the birds here, and eventually my dad said to them, this is mad, you coming all the way up here and doing this when we have us on site, people wanting to come and see them. We should take over this from you. We'll set up a partnership and start feeding the birds, and people can come up and see them and learn about them. So that really kind of focused minds on doing wildlife, I suppose, as a business, which then I guess focused minds further on, trying to protect and enhance even more. I think in the last couple of years, sorry, this is a long roundabout answer to your question, but I think in the last couple of years, we've really started to look at how we can increase that and do more of that. We've been running the kite project for a very long time. So officially we opened in 2003, but my parents have been doing part-time tours before that. But I think in some ways we never really kind of maximised what we were doing, or maximised the potential of the kites and the interest that people had in raptors and rewilding and all these things, which is growing all the time. And it was a couple of years ago, my dad was wanting to retire. We'd had a head ranger who'd been working for us for 14 years. He was a great guy, taught me everything I know about kites. And he moved south because his wife got a job down south, so he moved away. So Dad was looking to retire. Mike was suddenly gone, and I kind of found myself with a bit of a decision of what I was going to do, because I realised that I couldn't take on running the farm and kites and everything else. It was all going to be a bit too much with all these many diversifications we had. So we contracted out the farming, and I started to look for ways that we could do a bit more on the wildlife tourism side. Started feeding red squirrels and doing more wildlife events, and really from then on it's grown and grown, which has been really pleasing for something that was really punt. It's worked out well, and the more that people are interested in it, and the more people come to see these animals and see what we're doing here, the more, I suppose, license that gives us to try and enhance and protect the natural world, because you've got some income coming to do it now, which is really good. So yeah, very long answer to a short question, but it's increasing all the time.
Right, and you sort of mentioned red squirrels, and obviously your logo and your name style is all around sort of red kites. But let's talk about some of the other wildlife species that have benefited from what you're doing. I know that there's sort of three things on your website that you sort of allude to, and one of them is dragonflies. And a lot of people watching, and some people might not know, but you know that you have special dragonflies up in Scotland, dragonfly species that can't be seen south of the border. So let's talk about some of the other wildlife. What other wildlife have you got up there that's, because Scottish specialists, I think you have a pair of ospreys, is that right?
Right, yeah, we do. Yeah, for the last couple of years now, we've had ospreys breeding on the farm, which is super. Yeah, so they're a real highlight each year.
So when did they start breeding?
It was in 2018. Was it 2018? Come on, Tom. Yeah, 2018. Sorry, yeah, they started breeding here. So yeah, really exciting. So we're now sitting, waiting, and watching to see that they get back safely again this year.
Yeah.
The downside of ospreys is you have a nervous wait every year to see that they come home.
Exactly, yeah. So did you have to do any specific management for the ospreys, or did they just find you?
Well, I would love to be able to claim credit for this, but actually this had nothing to do with me. Our old head ranger, Mike, who I mentioned earlier, had this idea that he would build osprey nests here with the help of our tree climber, Keith Burgoyne, who comes out to climb trees when we go to ring all the raptors here. So this must have been back in about 2010 that we did this. Now, bear in mind, although we have ponds here, we're not particularly close to any large expanse of water or anything like that. So when Mike announced he was going to do this, my dad, who was in a particularly bad mood on that day, announced that he would be dead before ospreys ever arrived here. Fortunately, predictions of his own premature demise proved inaccurate, but a week later, after the osprey platforms were up, an osprey came and landed in one and started building it up.
Wow.
We've had ospreys coming here every year since then. They built 2 platforms initially and then a third one later on. The one that the osprey came and started building up actually had a bit of an unusual record, because while he was away finding more materials or fishing, a pair of kites stole in and took that platform, and so the chicks that pledged that nest were the first kite chicks ever to have pledged an artificial osprey nest in the UK. So, as I say, an unusual record. I don't think it'll be in the Guinness Book of Records anytime soon, but so that's what we did, and really since then we've done nothing more to those platforms. They've sat there just waiting. This male's been back every year and he's built them up and finally he got a female just at the tail end of the summer 3 years ago. So we started, watching it really carefully from 2 summers back to see that they came back. Sure enough, they did. And the first thing I knew about it was in the nesting season, and I was going off to check a buzzard nest nearby, and walked underneath this osprey platform and suddenly heard that unmistakable sound above my head, and looked up, and sure enough, 2 great big ospreys taking off over my head, which was just, wow, one of those moments,
Yeah, oh, that's amazing. That's amazing, and a real tribute to sort of how you guys are managing the farm, which is brilliant. Let's stay with raptors for a minute, because you've mentioned sort of owls, so various species of owl. You've now mentioned buzzard, red kite, osprey. Any signs of hen harriers around your area?
Yeah, we get hen harriers on the hill coming down in the winter. We don't have much heather cover here, so they don't tend to stick around into the breeding season, although there is a fair bit of heather on the hills further north. But yeah, we get male and female coming down and quartering the ground in the wintertime, which is fantastic. So we see them. We've seen most species actually. We've had goshawk breeding here before. In fact, after I finish this interview, I'm going out to see if I can find a nest that one of the neighbours spotted last year and see if they use it this year, which would be great. We've had the merlin, kestrels. I mean, like everywhere up in Scotland, kestrels aren't doing particularly well. But we've put up a lot of nest boxes, and we've gone up from 1 breeding pair a couple of years back to 3 pairs now. So they are going in the right direction, but we do have, a lot of competition from other raptors here. So it's probably reasonable to assume that we won't ever have huge numbers of kestrels again here, sadly. So yeah, a good mix of raptors actually. Yeah, we're really lucky where we are, and we've had white-tailed eagles in the past as well. When the RSPB reintroduced them in Fife, we had a young male that used to come and fly over the kite food feeding area, and kites next to the eagles just look like pigeons.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, that's amazing. And I know, you've clearly got a passion. It's tangible. It comes across for wildlife. But I know that there's a serious side to this as well. With the raptors, that you do monitoring on the estate. Who is it? The Scottish Raptor Study Group you work with, or?
That's right. Yeah. Which is a team of volunteers that cover all of Scotland. Each district has its own raptor group, so it's one of the largest citizen science projects on the go in Britain.
Yeah, and of course we hear a lot about sort of persecution of raptors up there. So where you're situated, are you sort of surrounded by, nowhere near, have a neighbour that's a sort of a grouse moor that's, how does the grouse moor around the area affect the birds of prey that might come onto your land?
Well, we are quite lucky where we are, that we don't have very many grouse moors around here, but on 2 of the only ones that are near here, kites and other raptors have disappeared or been found dead. I think in the early days, just to explain a wee bit for those that don't know the kind of Scottish scene, when kites were first reintroduced to this area, there'd been all this history of people believing that they were going to be a danger to all sorts of game birds and livestock, and that had left a long legacy. So part of our work and the RSPB's work in the early days of the project was showing that they were here on a working farm where we did our lambing outdoors, and they weren't taking anything, they weren't causing any bother at all. People historically used to believe that kites would take full-grown sheep and things like that. So, really there was a lot of work to correct that. Gradually we started to get through to people, and that was great. And actually a lot of the local gamekeepers donate a lot of food to us now, so if they're out culling deer, we get all the offal from that. Yeah, generally speaking, I think the pheasant shooting estates, that stopped being an issue as soon as we were able to show that they weren't a threat to pheasants, so that was good. And probably the walked up grouse shoots where, you know, people are just walking in a line across the hill and shooting the odd grouse, they're probably less of an issue as well. The difficulty is on the really intensively managed grouse shooting estates. That's where these birds either disappear or find quite alarmingly often. I mean, for kites, it's possibly less of an issue than it would be for hen harriers, like I mentioned earlier, or golden eagles, or even peregrines, you know, birds that are far more of a killer, far more of a danger to grouse. I think most people know now that kites aren't much of a danger, but sadly, it hasn't stopped them killing them in some of these places. So there's a couple of estates not too far from here that have both had general license restrictions placed upon them, stopping them from doing any kind of avian, in inverted commas, pest control because of raptors being found dead or traps and poison baits and things like that found there. So it is possibly the one kind of black mark against the kite reintroduction. It has been fantastically successful across most of Britain. I mean, here we have more kites than we could ever have imagined having. But there are certain areas where these birds just vanish, you know, areas that they should be where they're not. And that's the one thing that we're really still battling against, because although they're doing well, they should be doing even better. And we still have problem with people.
Yeah, and I know, because, you know, I've seen the posters in the background that you do invite people up there to do photography of red kites, and you know, you've got red kite hides, you've got the red kite feed, but also you play quite a sort of large part in educating people about sort of the red kites and Scottish wildlife. So how does that work? Do you have schools in, or is it general visitors? How does that work?
Mix of both, actually, Alan. Yeah, each day we put out a small amount of food for the kites. So really what you're talking about is about the weight of a rabbit's worth of food, which is being shared between kites, buzzards, crows, herons, all sorts of things, magpies. So enough that they have a small supplementary feed, but not so much that we're holding a huge number of kites here, stopping them from hunting and scavenging naturally. And people come and pay a small amount to come and see them and learn a bit about them from either myself, parents, or one of our team of volunteer rangers. We get school visits as well, which is really, really great. We do a lot with an organisation called the Royal Highland Education Trust, and they bring massive school groups out, and we show them all sorts of sides of estate management, and which the kites and the red squirrels and dragonflies and all these things are all part of it. They might just show them a little bit about what we have on our doorstep and why. Yeah, so that's very rewarding work.
Yeah, and it's key because we've just talked a few minutes about shooting on grouse moors and the persecution of raptors on grouse moors. So the more people that can be educated, especially those sort of that are up and coming that will be able to make decisions of the future, the more people can be educated about sort of the beauty of raptors and the importance of raptors, the better. So, it's great that you're doing something like that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, until the RSPB started showing people the ospreys that came back, I don't think anyone had ever considered this as a way of keeping them safe, putting birds in the public eye and letting them see them rather than trying to hide them away. But I think there's no doubt that engaging people with them in the way that you do as well, is really, really important, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to move on from sort of raptors, and we are going to talk about an animal you've already mentioned and one that I know you're particularly fond of, and that's the red squirrel. And I watched some of your talks, and what really surprised me was that I always thought, and I don't know why I thought this, but I always thought that the grey squirrels didn't get above basically the border, that they weren't in Scotland. I always thought that was the case. I don't know where I read it or how I thought that, but then when I watched one of your talks, you were talking about grey squirrels being an issue on your land, an issue that you've dealt with, which we'll come on to in a second. But Is grey squirrels quite widespread in Scotland? Because it came as a surprise to me.
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, I hadn't realised that. I have heard a few people saying about grey squirrels being more of an English animal in England, or the grey squirrels and reds being more of an English issue, but I hadn't realised that people maybe thought that down south of the border. Yeah, so grey squirrels are in certain areas of Scotland, of lowland and central Scotland. Where we are is pretty much the dividing line between the reds to the north and the greys to the south. As I'm sure you know, they were introduced by the Victorians, and one of the release sites apparently was in Edinburgh. And yeah, unfortunately, we do have a huge issue with the reds and greys in Scotland, which we're having to take a bit of action to try and keep the reds going here. This is one of the real priority areas. So if they spread beyond here and get into some of the wooded areas of Perthshire, north of here, yeah, I think it'd be quite hard to stop the greys moving north, and we could lose the reds quite easily if that happened.
Yeah, and so at the moment on your land, what's the balance between greys and reds? Have you managed to, and just to make people aware, I mean, clearly it's an emotive issue, but greys have to be managed. They have to be sort of eradicated. Just like goats on an island off New Zealand would have to be eradicated, or rats, so do grey squirrels. So whilst it's an emotive issue, it's key for the survival of the red squirrel. So what's the balance now like on your land? How what is it looking like? Have you managed to get rid of all the greys?
Well, at the moment we are red only. We during lockdown last year we did have a few grey squirrel sightings here, and yeah, we had to trap and kill them. I mean, with it, you're absolutely right. It's a really emotive issue. And for a while, we used to, I suppose, kind of duck it a little bit, but recently I've started to think that actually it's better to be totally upfront with people and let them make up their own mind about it, and just put it from our point of view. We're lucky here that we're a private reserve. We're not beholden to stakeholders or anything like that. Like a lot of the bigger organisations that are doing the grey squirrel control are, they have to be careful about what they say. But with us, we can be honest, and I think it's quite important to. With around here, so in the towns around here, there's still a lot of grey squirrels. And when I was growing up, this estate was grey only. The reds were gone, and then Mike, the old head ranger, signed us up for the forestry grant scheme, which essentially is trapping and killing grey squirrels. So it's a live trap, and you put some bait in, the squirrel runs in there, and the door closes behind them. And so if it's a grey squirrel you've caught, then you shoot it. And if it's a red squirrel, hedgehog, pine marten, then you just release it. So yeah, horrible thing to have to do, something we absolutely hate doing, but we've had amazing results since removing the greys from here. So over about 5 years, about 150 grey squirrels were killed on the estate, and suddenly we've had reds coming back in, spreading back into the area. And around the local area, it's been the same. All the estates around here are doing grey control, and suddenly we're starting to see reds back in places that they haven't been for decades. With the killing, some people aren't aware of why these two animals can't coexist, but the greys, a lot of them carry the squirrel pox virus, which is fatal to reds. The greys themselves are immune to it, the red squirrels aren't. And if the reds catch it, it's a bit like myxomatosis in rabbits. They come out in sores, they get disoriented, they lose weight, and dwindle over about a 2-week period. So it's a horrible, painful, nasty way for them to go. And the other issue is that greys are bigger, more adaptable than reds. They're able to eat acorns before they ripen, which means that basically combination of them being more aggressive and more adaptable means that even if the reds don't catch the virus, they're pushed out of their homes and left to starve. So to me, when I kind of weigh these things up, the way I justify it to myself is, as I say, we don't like having to do this. But I think it's a greater animal rights violation to allow the Reds, do nothing and allow the Reds to either starve or catch the virus than it is to quickly and as humanely as possible trap, kill the Greys. So that's where we come at it from. And as I say, in this area, it's been shown that the trapping does actually work and you can bring the Reds back. So there is that justification for it too.
Absolutely, and very well explained. It's a lot. There'll be a lot of misunderstanding around that, but at the end of the day, it needs to be done for the future of the red squirrels. And as hard as it is, that's a fact. It has to be done. So we'll move on, because you mentioned pine martens, and that was going to be one of my questions. Do you have pine martens? And clearly you do.
We do, yeah. Pine martens have been the bane of my life for the last couple of years. Because after setting up our red squirrel hides, my next target was to try and set up a marten hide. But although I can get them feeding for months on end, they always inevitably go away somewhere else. I think it's the downside for me of having so much connected woodland is that, why would they stay and just feed on peanuts and eggs all the time when there's so much other food around? But yeah, they've had remarkable comebacks in this area in the last few decades. When I was growing up, there were no pine martens anywhere around, but I think a general reduction in the amount of game shooting in the States has probably been part of the reason for it, and maybe just more encouragement from people that want to see them has led to a better perception of them in a lot of quarters. So they really are making a comeback now, and you find pine martens scattered everywhere around the woods, and everywhere that I set up red squirrel feeders, pine martens always come in there.
Excellent. And we also mentioned dragonflies. Now, I know, because I've sort of had a chat with you sort of outside the interview, that you don't have any of the Scottish specialists there, but you still have a really decent number of dragonflies because you manage the ponds on your farm. So roughly sort of how many species and what species are we talking about?
So we have the 12 species you would expect for this part of the world if conditions for dragonflies are good. So if there's clean water and clean air. And we don't do very much around the pond areas. The areas that we've turned into ponds are parts that were really unfarmable anyway. So, we turned them into ponds, fence them off, and just leave them be. So species we get common darters, black darters, four-spotted chasers, loads of damselfly species as well, large red, common blue, azures, emeralds. So yeah, a good number, a really pleasing number actually, yeah. And last year with lockdown, it was just such a great time with the combination of good weather and plenty of time to go out and see them all emerging from the pond. They're really a kind of new interest from me. It's only in the last year that we've started doing our own dragonfly tours. It was thanks to an amazing couple, Rory Mackenzie Dodds and his wife Carrie Kunitwata, who set up the first ever UK dragonfly sanctuary. And they live not far away from here and came and started doing dragonfly tours for us. And it just suddenly just lit a spark. And suddenly Rory had said that dragonflies were really the birders insects, and you could completely see why that was. It just, suddenly thought, oh, I've never paid attention to these things before. They're amazing. And so, yeah, a bit of a new obsession, but a really good one.
Yeah, well, have you moth trapped yet?
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's the newest one. I think this is the one that possibly my wife might divorce me for if I get any food here. Yeah, I bought a moth trap last year and we started doing it. Wow. A lot to learn there, though, Alan.
Oh, right, yeah. I mean, I've moth trapped now for a number of years, and I'm still learning. It's.
And whereabouts do you do it?
I'm in Norfolk, so I do it.
You do it?
Yeah, I do it in my garden. I do it at Penstoke, which is a nature reserve where I work, and I've done it at a couple of reserves where I volunteered as well. And yeah, it's phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. If you thought dragonflies were a distraction, wait till you really get into your moths. They're amazing.
Yeah, they are great, aren't they? And seeing some of these things close up as well. Yeah, it's funny. We, so as you know, we run a lot of events here, And generally speaking, they're really well attended. The only one that I've ever really struggled with was a moth trapping event where I think we got about 15 people, and it was such a shame because we ended up catching something like 250 different types of moths. It was incredible, and it was the first time I'd ever seen them close up, and the guy that ran it, who was a local moth recorder, was able to identify them all. And it just, mind blowing when you see them. But there's such misconceptions about moths, aren't there?
Oh yeah. I've actually done a Moths for Beginners piece on my YouTube, but I also do a talk on them. Not that I pretend to be a specialist on anything, but I do love moths. So right, so yeah, I did warn you that I might get distracted and digress. So I'm going to bring us back on track, but I'm going to sort of just step away from the farm and what you're doing there just for a second, and talk about the Scottish Rewilding Alliance, because I know that you're a part of that. How did that come about? How did you end up getting involved with that?
So what happened was in 2018, the Scottish Rewilding charity Scotland Big Picture ran the first ever Scottish Rewilding conference at Stirling University, and slightly violating the Trades Descriptions Act, I was invited to be on a panel for young rewilders. I think I was probably about a good 15 years older than any of the other young rewilders, so I made sure I shaved quite thoroughly before that. It was a great event, a really, really inspiring event, where you just started to feel for the first time that really rewilding was possible in Scotland. And at that event, the Rewilding Alliance was launched, and it's this loose alliance of all the major environmental NGOs in Scotland. So you've got the RSPB, the Woodland Trust, got Trees for Life, Scotland Big Picture, and I asked after the launch if there was any chance that we could join, fully expecting us to be too small to be of any interest to them, but they said yes, and I went to my first meeting shortly after that, and it's just a really nice, inclusive group, and I soon found out there really was no such thing as being too small to be involved with them, which was really good. It's for us coming from a sheep farming background, I always find myself in farming circles feeling like the most radical person in the room, and then a lot of time in kind of wildlife circles feeling like the most traditional, the right winger in the room, and I was very worried about that going into this group, but actually it couldn't have been further from the truth. It was very inclusive. People would listen to what you had to say, and so from there, having joined and gone to a few meetings, there was a chance to join the management committee. I was asked if I'd be interested in doing that, and said yes, and it's been great. A really, really good thing to be involved in. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and I know, because I saw the talk, that there's a really sort of ambitious plan up there to make Scotland the first rewilding nation, which is phenomenal, and clearly, has the habitats and the lands and all the, the land and all the rest of it. Is there any sort of, where you're based, is there any opportunities, because you said you were small, but is there any opportunities to join up land basically and grow outwards from where you are that will contribute towards that Rewilding the Nation project?
I think at the present time we've got a bit of work to do, if I'm totally honest. A lot of estates up here are still quite traditional, and rewilding for a lot of country people still seems like a threat rather than an opportunity, which I think it is an opportunity, a huge opportunity. And I think probably what will have to happen first, Alan, is there'll need to be a lot of support, which will lead to pressure on the government to have more rewilding, or rewilding is just a word, is that, habitat restoration as part of policy, which would then allow this to happen. I think at the present point, if we're being generous, we're still maybe as a country at the 2 or 3 out of 10 in our rewilding journey. But there is, as you say, a huge amount of potential. We are a very sparsely populated country. Most of the people in Scotland are concentrated into the big cities. So there's a lot of room to work with, but it probably needs more from the politicians to make that a reality. And I think that's one of the main goals of the alliance, is that we have to try and win hearts and minds and generate that support for what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, and I know what I'd like to do is sort of an interview specifically on Rewild Scotland, either with yourself or one of your colleagues going forward. So we won't go sort of too much in detail at the moment, but you mentioned that the RSPB were involved and other organisations. What my concern was when I first started seeing rewilding down here was that it would become fragmented and that there wouldn't be that collaboration. So, you know, it's great to see that there is actually, you know, a collaboration up there of organisations that are looking to actually take, and individuals that are looking to take that forward. So that's really positive. And as I say, it's a project that I'd really love to do a specific interview about. So, you know, maybe we can arrange that for the future.
Of course, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, it's a topic in itself. You know, you could easily talk for hours on that. So yeah, we'll definitely do that.
It is. I think, you know, first and foremost, and you sort of touched on it there, and you said rewilding, and then you said habitat restoration. I think there's still a lot of confusion around what the word rewilding is and what it means, and, you know, how you manufacture that, for want of a better phrase. So, you know, those are the types of questions that hopefully we can get to the bottom of in a separate interview. This is not me doing a sort of plug to say, you know, keep watching because we're going to do something else on. But yeah, I mean, it's a really, really interesting topic, and it's something we should delve into and give more time than we've got at the moment.
Of course, yeah.
So what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring you back to your farm. We've talked about species that are there. We've talked about species that have been there sort of, or not been there and have come back. So the likes of the red squirrel. Looking forward, or are there any particular species that you'd think I'd really like to see that on the farm?
Yeah, I mean, a few. The most imminent possibility, we're at the moment trying to see if we can get beavers moved from conflict areas in Scotland to Argaty. So at the moment, as we speak, we're just winding up the consultation phase of that, and we'll be putting in an application, having first spoken to the Species Reintroduction Forum in springtime. So beavers, don't know how much you know about the history of them in Scotland Island, but just to give a kind of overview for people that don't know about them. We have two separate populations of beavers in Scotland. We have an officially sanctioned reintroduction site in Argyll on the west coast. A trial project was set up there. It's very much a closed off waterway where beavers couldn't move from this site in Knapdale and enter into the main waterway system. And so the Scottish Government set up that trial to see what impact they might have on local ecology, tourism, economy, all these things. We've got that population which are doing okay, but we also have this other population which for a long time was completely unknown, right in the centre of Scotland, just a wee bit north of where we are now. And what happened was that beavers somehow escaped from private enclosures. There's some debate as to whether they escaped or were released, but they went right into the main river stems in the heart of Scotland. And where they are, there's a lot of really good agricultural land. Scotland doesn't have very much prime agricultural land, but most of it is right where the beavers came out into flat land where beavers flooding can cause huge problems for people farming right up to the edge of the water on this flat land, so it doesn't take a lot to flood it. And so because people knew that beavers had such a good impact on biodiversity and the wetlands store carbon and purified water and all these good things, there was a huge amount of support for having them there, which the Scottish Government in 2016 granted those beavers the right to remain in Scotland But because people were still killing them in huge numbers, there was more pressure, and that led to, in 2019, the beavers being given European protected status. There was a stipulation in the agreement, though, which allowed landowners that were having problems with beavers in these prime areas, allowed them to apply for a lethal control licence if other mitigation measures have been trialled and failed. Now, for whatever reason, those licenses were handed out in huge, huge numbers. And in 2019, the first year of protection, in the end, it was 87 beavers that were killed on the licence, which represented a fifth of the population of beavers in Scotland. The Scottish Government said no at that point to translocation of beavers out of conflict sites to anywhere other than Knapdale, the West Coast Reintroduction Project official trial, or down to England, private enclosures there. So there was no way that you could move them to other places in Scotland apart from Knapdale and all less controversial places where they could do a lot of good and take the heat out of the problem. Because of these kill stats, because they're so high, there's been a huge amount of public pressure again to try and get the government to change their minds on that. And last year in meetings, the Scottish Government agreed to allow translocation within existing range. So if beavers were already close by, they would consider applications for that. So where we are here, we have the River Argaty, which runs through our land, which is a tributary of the River Teith. Now, beavers are on the Teith about 5 kilometres from here. They're also in all the surrounding rivers, so all the upper Forth catchments and the Allen Water and such like. And so it's a matter of time before they swim up the Teith a few kilometres away and just come up the Argaty to us anyway. But we're trying to speed that up and advance the process just to save a few of these animals from being killed in other areas. So that's our big drive at the moment, trying to get that done. And you know, once we've done that, to be honest, I mean, we may look in some years' time to have some other kind of reintroduction. It may just be that I got back exhausted after the beavers and just to say that was all right. We'll enjoy this for a few years before we do anything else, because it's been quite a time-consuming, upsetting, enthralling experience so far. All these things, but it does knock it out of you a bit doing it. So it may be that we stop on the back of that and just enjoy where we're at for a bit more.
Right. Okay. Well, best of luck with that. I hope it comes off, because you're clearly putting the effort in. Okay, so that's a reintroduction. So, and potentially in the future, you might have other reintroductions, as you've said. What about sort of wildlife that is not particularly on your farm or using your farm at the moment? You think either you'd, or might even be using your farm, but in small numbers. Where would you like to see the increases or the new species moving in? You know, is it sort of found birds? You know, what area would you like to see sort of naturalized increases?
No, that's a good question. Yeah, we're doing a lot of tree planting at the moment, in the hope that it's all kind of native tree types, lots of cherries, rounds, and things like that. And we'd love to see a good increase in the smaller birds as a result of that. If the beavers come as well, I would hope that they would bring all the known biodiversity boosts that they do. So big boosts in insects and birds and bats and all these things. I would like, what we've been trying to do, you know, in the last few years, aside from feeding the squirrels, what we've really been trying to do is focus on that lowest tier of the food chain and really try and boost the insect numbers, in the belief, I suppose, that if you can get that sorted, then everything else should go from there. So, you know, we've installed new ponds around the place, done a lot of planting and all these things, just trying to do something that makes a habitat for them. So I guess, you know, it will be the small things really that we would like to see the increases in. Potentially, I mentioned kestrels earlier, more nest boxes out for them, for barn owls and things that are struggling a bit in this area would be part of the plan as well, you know, and just see if we can give them a little bit of a boost too. So yeah, smaller I think is what we're going to be focusing on mainly.
Excellent. And so from your personal point of view, when you get up on a morning, because it must be amazing getting up when you get up in the morning. When you get up in the morning, this is just a bit of fun to end, but what is the one species that you think, if I see that today, I will be happy, that's already there?
Okay, so I think probably our big one, and I would have had a different answer for you as recently as 2 weeks ago, because I didn't know this one was here, but 2 weeks ago we were away planting aspen trees up at one of our farms on the hill, and we got that quick flash above the water and realised it was a kingfisher on the far bank. So I would say if we saw a kingfisher, that would, seeing kingfishers again would be the one that really just was up there, you know?
Brilliant, brilliant. Well, thanks for your time, because it was really good insight into how farming and farming can work for wildlife. Because I think there's a lot of misconception that they're the two things that run on parallel, but they clearly can work hand in glove. So, and congratulations on what you're doing, because from the very little I've seen, it looks fantastic. And who knows, one day, when we're allowed out to play again, I might be able to get up there and come and have a look for myself.
I hope so.
So, and yeah, I look forward to sort of seeing, number one, how sort of your farm progresses, but number two, how Rewilding Scotland progresses. And say, I would like to sort of do some interviews around that. But for now, that was brilliant, a brilliant insight, brilliant work that you're doing up there. Congratulations to you and the family, and thank you ever so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Tom. Take care.
Brilliant.
Thanks. Bye.
Excellent. Bye.